A lot of people look at Iran in this country. They look at Iran and they see that layer of society that they think looks like them. And they say, wow, they look like us. And they demonstrate just like us. And I can read their signs because they're in English. And they Twitter and they text and they, and so there's an immediate identification that I think has deceived a lot of people in the progressive movement. But the interpretation that they come up with, that this is a pro-democracy movement being crushed by a brutal, repressive government, it rests on two things. One is misinformation of the facts, and the other is bad politics. And you can deal with the first one, but it's much harder to deal with the second. And of course, no one ever asks, what about the workers? What's this situation of the workers in Iran? Now, you may have heard about the poll that was done by the Terror-Free Tomorrow group 3 weeks before the election in Iran. It was funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, so this was not a leftist poll per se. And it predicted that Ahmadinejad would win 2/3 of the vote based on the support that he had in the country. Now, where does that support come from? Is it because there are so many people in the country who are quote-unquote backward and religious, traditionalists, fundamentalists, and so on, and that's their motivation? Actually, no, that's not true. And I like to quote bourgeois sources for good facts because they tend to be less assailable. There's a fellow named Ervan Abrahamian who he's here in New York actually, CUNY, C-U-N-Y, Distinguished Professor in Department of History, Baruch College, and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, author of A History of Modern Iran. And he wrote a piece, and this is sort of a genre almost of Iranians who write for policymakers in the United States, trying to get them away from the stereotypes and the demonization so they can have a more realistic view of the country they're trying to undermine. And his paper, called Why the Islamic Republic Has Survived, argues that it's because the Iranian government has delivered on its promise to help the poor. That's a bourgeois assessment. In the book we put together, In Defense of Iran, there's a professor, an Iranian-American professor at Virginia Tech, who wrote a piece in 2007 for the World Bank, examining poverty and inequality in Iran since the election. And it's a really interesting paper in which he points out that poverty today in Iran, well, in 2007, is 1/8 of what it was in 1979. The poverty has been reduced to 1/8. Now, poverty, according to the World Bank, is living on $2 or less a day. $1 or less a day is extreme poverty. But if you're in Iran, you have free education up through the university level. If you can get in, there's not enough seats in the top level. You can always go to one of Mr. Rafsanjani's 300 private for-profit college campuses. That's an alternative. If you're poor, you're guaranteed, everyone is guaranteed health care. It's in the Constitution. But if you're poor, you don't have to pay. It's a pay as you go. It's not free for everyone, like say in Cuba. But if you can't afford it, they just take care of you. And the second point that he made that I thought was even more interesting was that in addition to the level of poverty dropping, the income gap between the poor and the middle class had narrowed. So it wasn't just that oil revenue had allowed the country to raise millions of people out of poverty. It's that the income gap was reduced, and that means that the policies favored the poor. Now, there was a report done on the healthcare system in Iran by the US Library of Congress. It said, since the revolution, according to the report, quote, substantial progress has been achieved both in the social and economic sectors, unquote. More than 85% of the population in rural areas now has access to primary healthcare services. Immunization for children and pregnant women is, quote, very extensive. Access to safe drinking water, quote, has been provided for over 90% of Iran's rural and urban population. And, quote, more than 80% of the population has access to sanitary facilities. And this is in a country that until 1956 didn't even have a national census. Rural electrification. There was once a great community organizer in Russia named Vladimir Lenin who said that electricity equals socialism. And electricity has been brought to the rural areas of Iran. People have television sets, they have telephones, they have radios. Television that is used by the government in conjunction with the World Health Organization to provide educational programs to the rural poor, including self-esteem classes for women. Bet you didn't hear that one on CNN. So the majority of people in Iran are not the middle class. It is a divided society. It's not a socialist country. It's a mixed capitalist economy. It's a capitalist economy in which, by the Constitution, the major industries like oil and gas have to be owned by the government, which is a source of their ability to provide services to the poor. But another substantial part is cooperatives, and then there's the private sector. And one of the big debates in the last election was how fast to move the privatization of the state-owned section of the economy, because a new law was passed in 2004, Article 44 of the Constitution, which calls for privatization. And some of our political opponents say, yeah, but Ahmadinejad is privatizing too. He's privatizing public industry. And it was interesting, because it's good to research. It's really good to know what the facts are. Because it's true, he was forced by law to nationalize, I think it was some banks. And so he divided the banks up into little shares and gave them out to the poorest people in the country and said, don't sell it, hang on to it. Don't sell it to anybody. He was forced by law, but he gave them to the poor, and he was attacked for that as a cheap campaign gimmick. I say, bring on those cheap campaign gimmicks. I'm still thanking George for the money we got in the last administration, and we're still waiting for the Democrats to come through. So there was a social base there that constituted roughly 2/3 of the country, which is what, and Ahmadinejad got 62% of the votes. On the question of the elections, just really quickly, how could, there was 85% turnout, some 45 million votes, how could they be counted in 2 hours and announced? This is proof that this was a rigged election. Okay, number one, they weren't counted in 2 hours. The election ended on Friday. They were announced on Saturday. Rostam Purzal of the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran, a close friend and collaborator of mine, was in Tehran. So that's what he saw. The announcement came the next day. Secondly, there's 60,000 polling stations. If you divide the number of votes by the number of polling stations, you get about 680 votes per polling station. You can count those by hand in a matter of hours. And then, for the first time, the votes were sent electronically from the local polling stations to Tehran, where they were counted by volunteers, mostly college students, mostly Mousavi supporters. Now, this thing about electronic transfer of the votes, nobody's mentioned that, but that's what happened. So, of course, you could count 45 million votes and the next day announce them. Was it a smart idea on the government's part? Probably not. They should have stretched it out to the normal 3 days because it raises questions. But technically, there's no reason why it couldn't have happened. So you've got the factual argument for why the election might well have been exactly what they said it was, and you've got the social base with the numbers. The other thing I just wanted to mention was, which is really a much bigger question, so for my last minute and a half, the present state right now, President Obama has said we're got an open hand out to Iran and we want to talk. And we hope they do accept this invitation because it's not open-ended. First he said, you got basically to the end of the year. And so Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel said, fine, we won't attack at least until the end of the year. And Joe Biden, our vice president, somebody's vice president, said, well, nothing we could do about that. That's your sovereign right. He might as well have said we support self-determination for the Israeli government. Except that every bomb, every plane, every missile that Israel possesses was paid for by our tax money.